All right, so this is technically not a chat. It's our first deep dive, which we're going to try and start doing things a separate series. So we'll have our regular chats where we just talk about stuff, and then the deep dives where we both do research on a topic and then try and make it more informational. And I realize doing this, there's going to be a lot of conversation too. But I tried to make sure I have enough notes that there's like interesting things to learn.
Absolutely. And we picked a doozy to start with.
It didn't feel like that when we picked it.
That's fine. So we chose Taoism. Now, we're going to start right off the bat by saying we're going to be talking about the philosophy of Taoism, not the religion. More.
Here's the
Really?
thing. Here's the
Really?
thing. You do no, if you do some research, they're indistinguishable. However, because there was never a separate non-religious Taoism. That's a modern concept. However, it was not a unified religious thing until the Celestial Master School. So the thing is that Taoism was never a
I too
philosophy.
hopped on Wikipedia today, Michael.
I'm just saying that it's a modern concept, that there's no religious take on it. The weird thing is,
I
uh,
guess let me preface. Okay, let me take a step back and kind of rephrase what I said because you're right. You're absolutely right, and I will admit that first off. Uh, it's we're not going to be talking about it as a religion as a like westernized version of a religion,
we're not going to talk about the practices that they did as a like a religious organization.
right? Because Taoism does have a pantheon technically and things like that.
Okay, here's the thing: the Tao Te Ching doesn't have any of that.
Correct. That is more
So
philosophical.
what we're going to talk about is specifically the Tao Te Ching and the things that come out of that, not and stopping at the like highly organized religious elements of it. We're going to skip
Yes,
that middle modern philosophizing of it.
absolutely. The best, absolute best way to start this talk, other than that little preface we just did, is to read. It's the best way to start it is the best way that he
This,
or they started.
the start of the Tao Te Ching.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I will read the first line because that will preface all the bullshit that we're going to spew after this. The Tao that can be followed is not the eternal Tao. Tao loosely translating to way. So the way that can be followed is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. So anything we say,
You said follow. The way that can be spoke is not the eternal way. The way that can be named is not the eternal name. You said follow. The whole point of Taoism is following. But yes, you cannot talk about the Tao. You can talk about Taoism, and you can talk about your understanding of Taoism, but you cannot talk about like the essence of Taoism. Like you
right?
can't. There's no word for it. Taoism is a placeholder.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me actually help articulate your point. So that was one translation. We are going to be running into some translation issues on top of the esoteric fact
Yeah.
that Tao is more of a feeling and a force than a manifest. It's again, I'm running out of words because that's the whole point.
However,
Let me read that again in a different translation, and then we can dive in. I just want people to have the real perspective of all the different ways we're going to look at this.
this is why your anime character has a book.
Yep, I got two translations. I have three. I just lost one. This is also the Tao Te Ching is the number one book that I gift that I give away to people, followed closely by a negotiation book, but that's more interpersonal stuff. So this other translation is by William Scott Wilson, who's one of my favorite translators of Eastern works. The way that can be articulately described is not the unchanging way. The name that can be said out loud is not the unchanging name. And the fact that there's so many different translations of this text articulates that perfectly. It really exemplifies that.
Yeah. I mean, this is right up my alley, which has been your point for a long time, is that
Hmm.
I'm my personal philosophy built entirely out of Western uh, studies and Middle Eastern studies. Um, what I distilled out of all the Western stuff was fundamentally Taoism.
Yes, yeah, and Taoism. So just to put some perspective around it, this is relatively new to you, like the study of it.
Hmm.
I have been in touch with it. I've been researching it. I've been reading it. It's been a part of my life since I was around 16 or 17. Starting with just my love of Eastern culture and philosophy. Studying martial arts really is a part of that. Taoism does have martial arts attached to it as well. Tai Chi being probably the most famous one,
Hmm.
and Bagua, which is the airbending martial art in Avatar.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. There's going to be a lot of Avatar references because they do such a wonderful job of lacing in all of those concepts.
Hmm. Oh, I didn't realize that it was the like the three schools or the three whatever like the how big of a deal that was in the like the Eastern culture until I started doing the research.
Precisely. The three schools, since this is informational, being
Yeah.
Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism.
Hmm.
Do
And how intertwined they became very quickly.
Yes, yeah. I think the best way to describe the version of the three schools at that time is by a famous painting with a parable attached to it.
Vinegar.
Yes, the vinegar tasters, I think it translates to as the
Hmm.
title. And it is characters or representations of the Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu, who is uh, the author, supposed author of the Tao Te
So
Ching.
we'll pause before you continue with your story. People used to believe that it was written by one guy. Not modern, scholars of the 20th century were like, that's unlikely. And they recently discovered some of the earliest possible written forms of it, and they're like, mm, there's a good chance it was one person. So it went from real to folklore to kind of on the Jesus thing, where it's like it's kind of real, but there's a lot of like messy bits in there.
Yeah, and Lao Tzu was not his name.
Right.
It's a
The
title. It means
title.
venerable master, I believe, or old master, something like that. Confucius is also a title. I don't remember the translation, but that's not his name.
Hmm.
Buddha is also a title. It's not his name. There's a theme here. So, anyways, uh, the painting depicts they have all stuck their fingers into a vat of vinegar and have tasted the vinegar, and all three of their faces depict a representation of their philosophies. So Confucius tastes the vinegar and sees that it is sour, and the Confucian philosophy, to be very, very general, because it's quite deep, but the Confucian philosophy is that we want to try and impose order on the chaos that is the world because heaven itself is in order. So we're trying to mirror the order of heaven.
But to emphasize the taste thing, the vinegar represents the world, life. So he tastes it as sour because he's like, it just it doesn't sit right on the tongue. It needs to be flavored better, ordered,
Precisely. Yes. Uh, the Buddha saw it as
bitter.
bitter. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So it's not a flavor he didn't like. Just ugh.
Right. Yeah. So the Buddha felt it as bitter, which Buddhism is probably the most famous of these three religions worldwide, globally.
Well, because the other
Uh,
two aren't religions, but
yeah. And so
wasn't competing
Buddhism,
in the race.
pretty much, Buddhism is about the fact that mundane life, the world, is full of suffering, and we must learn to detach ourselves from such suffering in order to find true peace and happiness. And if you want to go into the more religious aspects of it, to remove yourself from the reincarnation cycle and actually enter a form of heaven. They call it
And
nirvana.
to do a comparison, Confucianism says we want to make heaven on earth. Buddhism says you need to get the fuck off of earth.
Right. Yes. And
And then
we come
Lao,
to Lao
Lao
Tzu,
Tzu.
who tastes the vinegar and is smiling because he sees it as sweet, essentially. Not even though he doesn't see it so much as sweet, he just accepts the vinegar for what it is. It's sweet because it's vinegar,
Yeah,
right?
it tastes vinegary, and he's like, this is good vinegar.
Exactly. So, if we have Buddha is life is suffering, we must get off of Earth. Confucius is Earth is messy and we have to clean it up to make heaven on Earth. Lao Tzu basically is saying that heaven is already, or Earth is already heaven.
Or just, don't expect vinegar to taste like something that isn't vinegar.
Precisely. Yeah. I have since studying more of this recently, because I would look at it pretty hard for a while, and every once in a while throughout the years read excerpts of the Tao Te Ching. And it's very easy to do that since it's laid out in 81 small short chunks, poems
Mhm.
in a sense. So I've been doing that since deep diving in the past few weeks. Uh, the concepts are new and fresh, and Taoism is one of those philosophies where it's new every time you pick it up, because as you grow and experience life, Taoism only enhances the new things that you've seen and the new perspectives that you have.
And you decipher the text. Certain parts of it are just jumbled words the first time you read it. And there's parts where you're like, yeah, I remember like this meaning something. And then you read another part, you're like, I don't even remember that being in here because you just couldn't process it the first time.
Precisely. There's a famous saying that I didn't get for a long time until things like this started happening. The saying is, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And I love that because it's also the the reason I have such a book buying habit is not because I'm going to read every single book that I buy in the order that I buy it, but
Mm.
I have the information I want when I'm ready to receive it, including books. And there are books I've gotten to a point of maturity now where I'm reading a book going, you can kind of tell I'm not ready for this info. It's not landing yet. So you put it away and wait for later. Patience is a virtue, that's for damn sure. So, but that is kind of the essence of the comparison of those three religions on a very general sense. Now, there is tons of interplay between them. Many, even modern Chinese people, practice all three in their ways.
Because they're that's the thing. So it's three schools, not three religions. Confucianism is a legal system. Taoism is a cosmogony, right? Right? I think it's the word cosmogony. The way the world was made. Then
Cosmology,
Buddha, mm, cosmology is slightly different. I think it's only we had con.
magic, glowing rectangles connected to the
What's
entire
it con?
knowledge of humankind.
What was even the word I said? Cosmology.
I don't know.
Google correct me. Cosmogony. I don't know. Whatever. Point is, Taoism doesn't because it doesn't deal with the gods and stuff like that. Like it'll pull that in. There's text, Taoist texts relate to that, but that's not what it's about. And then
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism is an actual religion. So you could have a Taoist understanding of how the world was made, a Confucius legal system, and then practice the religion of Buddhism. They're three separate dynamics, which is why for the culture they kind of meshed perfectly because
Precisely.
Buddhism overtook much of the Taoist religious practices really quickly.
Precisely. Yeah. Um, and the Taoist religic, like religious stuff, it can be loosely compared to Catholicism in that there are Taoist and Catholic saints that you can attribute certain
Yeah, in
thoughts
the
towards. Yeah.
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 After it was unified in the Celestial Master School, it's the whole point of the Celestial Masters.
Right. A
Early
lot.
Taoism. Oh, go on.
I was just going to add that a lot of, if you're into kung fu movies, whether they're good or campy, if you're into kung fu movies, a lot of them have to do with that. They'll show, you know, the Taoist sages or the immortals, Taoist immortals,
And
things of that nature.
that's a big thing. But that's because prior to the codification of the Celestial Master School and similar schools or similar like religious organizations for Taoism. It was mainly based in reformed folk religion and shamanism. And the shamanism eventually evolved into alchemy.
Yes, yeah. Which it's one of those weird historical human things of that alchemy and the like more Renaissance kind of alchemy were separate. I think they were even different time periods. I would have to check that, but they
According,
kind of all
according to one article
centered
I
around the same.
read, the word alchemy might have actually come through China to the Middle East.
Really? Okay. I
Because
could believe that because Chinese civilization
it's like,
was advanced quite earlier than most others.
because I think I'm gonna butcher. I tried to look up all the pronunciations for the Chinese stuff, and I just some of them I couldn't even find. But it's
Right.
like kamyak was the like word for alchemy. So then when the Middle East got it, they added al, so it was the kamyak of God. So al kamyak, and then that switched over to alchemy once it got farther out west.
That would make sense because if you go east, the Japanese word for gods is kami, where they kind of simplified the Chinese a little bit.
Hmm.
That's interesting. I did not know that. This is why we're doing this. I love it.
And Taoist Buddhism was Shen Buddhism, which became Zen Buddhism in Japan. So Zen, here's the thing about Zen is I never thought Zen had anything to do with Buddhism. It turns out it is 100% to do with Buddhism. Taoism goes into Buddhism, becomes Zen Buddhism. You take the Taoism back out of Buddhism, and now it's just Zen.
Correct. Yes. Yeah, so it's all quite intertwined. They play nicely together,
Hmm.
is kind of the main point of this. So, and that's, anyone looking into these things, um, don't feel like you have to abandon other schools of thought for anything new that you learn. The whole point is to try and synthesize them. That is part of the Tao. It's all manifestations of the universe.
Which, to that credit, it seems more pure to Taoism to not be a Buddhist. Because you don't need to escape anything. Like the fundamental Tao Te Ching, which isn't the original Taoist text. Did you know that?
I did, yes.
It's
Yeah, the
the
stuff that is written is later thoughts.
there was an earlier written one, the Sa
Well,
Ye
there's
Sa
the Shuang the Chuangzi,
that comes after.
right?
And that's a collection of stories. I tried to read that. Mistake. Um, where is it? I actually have pages of notes for this one.
Wonderful.
Um, oh, the Nenya, the inner
Okay,
training or the inner enterprise is a more accurate translation.
sure.
But it's one of the first big written works for Qi,
Yeah.
but it also mentions the Tao. It's the first place the Tao appears. So that came first. So Tao and Qi were like together, and then the Tao Te Ching pulled just the Tao part out to emphasize it.
Yes. Yeah. Do you mean ki? So ki is Japanese for chi. Is that what? Is it the QI?
Yeah, Qi,
Yeah. So it's chi. Yeah.
Qi.
Q in that translation is a ch sound. I don't know how they came up with that stuff to be honest, but you just
Yeah.
kind of have
Again,
to
I'm
learn that.
going to go through and butcher the translations, which is upsetting because I usually like being good at languages, but the Eastern languages is not an area I've practiced much in.
Right. Right. Yeah.
But po-
And
point
it's
point is,
yeah.
the Tao Te Ching people think of as like, oh, that's where Taoism came from. It does not. It came from an earlier text. The Tao Te Ching is just taking just a little bit of text that mentions it and expanding on it.
Right. Yeah. And the story of that book is Lao Tzu was a high-ranking bureaucrat, essentially, and got pretty fed up in a Confucian court, as most were,
Hmm.
and just got fucking sick and tired of it. He retired. He decided to retire. Got on his trusty water buffalo because I guess that's what old men ride in China, and it's like the Buick, just big and reliable.
And not as pretentious as a horse.
Right, exactly. And as he got to the border of that state, of that country at the time, the story goes the guard there recognized him, knew who he was, and knew that he was a venerable master, Lao Tzu, and requested that he put something down for people to take lessons from his knowledge and his life. So he, wrote the Tao Te Ching. I could honestly see it's very Taoist for him to be like, oh, and write the first line as like
Yeah.
a, yeah, as a tongue in cheek thing. Since
You
I'm
want me
writing
to?
it down, this is pointless.
Yeah.
But I'm
Reader
glad,
beware.
yeah, I'm glad he did that. Whether
Mhm.
that story is true doesn't really matter. It's a wonderful story and very,
Part
yeah.
part of the story, and this is important for the Taoist tradition, is that the person said that he's like, okay, yeah, you know who I am, but like you don't know about the Tao thing. You're just making that up. He's like, no, no, no. Like I read the stars. Like, I'm very studied in the ways of like the mechanisms of the world because that's me understanding the way. And he was like, okay, all right.
Yeah, yeah.
But
And so, and that's a
that
big
lesson,
part of it. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, and that the reason that story is important is because it's meant to show that like to become a disciple of a proper esoteric school, in this case Taoism, you had to practice. You had to show you were ready to even just hear the stuff, not learn it. You had to like have a resume of like, look, here's the things I studied on my own and have become proficient at.
Hmm. And then you had to prove, this might be a modern idea, but then you had to prove you were ready to receive new information.
Hmm.
Because that's another ancient parable of the cup. The student goes to the master, a prospective student goes to the master. Master, I wish to learn from you. I've studied this and this, and I've read these analects, and I know the star charts and da. And the master says, let's sit and have some tea first. And he starts pouring tea into the student's cup and keeps pouring, and it overflows and keeps pouring. Master, stop, my cup is full already. Exactly, says the master. It's one of those things. And that's a very, very important life lesson is, you and I, Michael, are obsessed with the acquiring of knowledge.
Hmm.
Um, but it must be done with humility, uh, because we
And
don't we
moderation.
don't do it to say we do it.
Hmm.
Yeah, we do it because we're constantly seeking, we're constantly synthesizing ideas. We're not married to any particular ideology because we want new information. We have the same baseline ideology because it's as close to the truth as we can get right now, personally. And we're
Hmm.
always trying to add to that and course correct as we see fit. A big part of that is actually, I'm going to hold up another book. It's The Tao of Pooh. I highly recommend this book by Benjamin Hoff, Hoff, to those who want to get a sense of Taoism. It's basically the author uh, telling through stories and through easy to understand paragraphs how Winnie the Pooh is like the Western Taoist.
Hmm.
And so he has a good way of explaining these things pretty simply because they are really large concepts, as large as you want to make them.
Some would say so large that they are beyond large.
Precisely, yes. I'm gonna there's I'm gonna kind of force I'm gonna wedge this part into the conversation. The concept of the Tao for people who are completely unfamiliar with it, uh, it's where George Lucas got the idea for the Force in Star Wars,
Well, okay,
essentially.
that's one of the things about the Tao is Taoism pervades almost all other modern metaphysics and mysticism.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, it goes quite macro, like as macro as you can possibly go, beyond comprehension. And that's the point.
Hmm.
They admit that fully. Um, that's kind of the modern base, or not the modern, the basis of the philosophy and the religion is we are infinitesimally small and cannot possibly comprehend the the grandiose universe as a whole and the forces that lie behind it.
However, we are that force.
Yes, that's the important part. Thank you.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it's very much a an intrinsic feeling. We just know there is a life force. We are alive. We are proof of it. But no one has yet to prove where a soul comes from, or the concept of the soul.
Well, and even beyond that, it's you've heard me do this rant before, but it had to be a unity factor, and that's the Tao.
Right, right. And so we'll dive a little bit more into it, but because of this grandiose idea and also how we are manifestations of it, uh, various practices arose throughout history to not control it, but to kind of get in the flow of it or try to catch some of the
Cultivate.
flow,
Yep.
cultivate some of it. Yes, absolutely. It's where the idea of chi comes from, the life energy.
So the concept of chi came first, and this is where it's important to
Yes.
understand. If
So
you
did the symbol
studied,
of the yin yang. The duality school came before Taoism.
yes, but was an entirely separate school from both the Qi school and the Taoist school. It was
Right.
the naturalist school.
Right.
Um, yeah, there could be some fun bits when we talk about like was it thousand schools or hundred schools, whatever it was.
The 100 schools of thought. Yes.
But the thing is that uh, if you just read the Tao Te Ching, then you heard that there was like alchemy and martial arts and religion, it wouldn't really make sense, to be honest, because like all that seems like fluff when the point is the wu wei, no action. So it's like this is a lot of action for no action. But if you know that it came originally from the concept of qi, it's like, well, the qi is the life force of the Tao within you, and you can cultivate that life force. So the predecessor to it was that there is this energy you can cultivate, which is which is the Tao manifest in its life energy. So that was a
Yes.
prerequisite for it. So then it's like, okay, the people are doing that because they already believed in the manipulation of stuff, not intervening, not forcing, but cultivating.
Precisely. And that is a major part of that. That's the seed of much of modern storytelling. You see it in Avatar, the cultivation of chi manifests as the bending of the elements.
Mm-hmm.
In Star Wars, it's the Force. It's them using the Force. In Naruto, chakra, which is a different energy that they talk about in India mostly, but you know, Naruto calls it chakra, but it is chi,
Mm-hmm.
and it manifests through the use of hand signs and movements and cultivating and all that stuff into their ninjutsu abilities. And in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, probably the most um, famous kung fu movie out there. Uh, they do all these things. You know, they can stand on one foot on a leaf in a tree, that kind of stuff through the cultivation of chi, and they can read it. And you know, all those things were in Kill Bill. You know, you can that what do they call it? The 5 finger death punch or something like that. No, that's different. That's a different thing from a different movie. But pressing certain areas blocks the chi, and then it will eventually kill your organs. You know, all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
There's even a martial art, if you want to call it that, not to be disrespectful, but called dim mak, the death touch, where apparently you can, you know, through one good blast of chi, like stop someone's heart, that kind of thing.
So one of the funny things is, in theory, um, and there is video evidence of these types of things, but the point is the chi is connected to the Tao. The thing about it is it uh, has the three treasures: humility, moderation, and modesty, or kindness, or there's a bunch of different ways that third one's translated. But the thing is, if you were to try and show off your chi, it is bound to fail.
Yes,
So, one, people that say they're going to do it to show it certainly aren't masters because they would already know better. And even if a master intended to, he there would it's a counterproductive thing. One, masters don't because of that rule, and two, one of the reasons they don't do it is because even if they were to do it, if it was perceived internally or too much externally as them showing off, it would stop their chi. It would disrupt it. So just a funny tidbit.
precisely.
That
And that harkens back to one of the lines in the Tao Te Ching, loosely translated, those who it is basically those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know.
hmm I I posted a TikTok a little bit ago because I wanted to see what kind of TikTok content there was about Taoism, There's a lot of people being like, "Oh, I'm such on a Taoist kick, and it's so cool," and like people saying they don't understand it. I'm like, you don't understand it. Like, unless you preface like, um, similar to how in Islam, it's praise be unto him. Every time we talk about Taoism, it starts with the Tao that can be talked about is not the internal Tao. Like you have to preface your conversation with that. If you're just like, it's so cool, you have already missed the point.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's one of those things. Like you have to. It's just an understanding as we talk about it that it's superficial at best. You know, or a an example, or it can't be nailed down. It's like
Which
water. Water is a huge example used in the Tao Te Ching and all of Taoism. Bruce Lee talks about water and how it is formless, but takes the form of whatever you put it in, and how it can not be grasped. If you try to catch water, it's just going to leave your hand. One of those things. And it can
and I
roar and crash and trickle and stream, and it can do all those things without acting, without forcing itself to do that stuff, which is where Wu Wei comes from.
mhm.
Good segue. Like water. Yeah.
I
So
think
Wu
in the
Wei. Sorry,
oh,
go ahead. Yeah.
I was right in the Tao Te Ching, it talks about water being because it constantly talks about how like the meek will inherit the earth was first done in Taoism, in the Tao Te Ching. But it talks about how the soft will defeat the strong, and it uses water as an example. It's like water is soft, but if you need to break something down, there is no better natural resource because water will eventually erode anything.
Absolutely. And hearing these things, it's talked about kind of poetically, but it's good to absorb that and then hear it other places. Like I remember listening to, I used to listen on car rides to a job that I hated, uh, like motivational speeches, that kind of a thing, to try and pump
Mhm.
myself up. Like I can do this. I don't suck. Turns out the job and me just didn't match up. That's a whole nother story. But I remember one of them. I wish I remember his name. He talked about how sometimes there's no winning against a bad situation or a bad mindset, like actual like depression and things like that. Sometimes there's no winning against it. Sometimes the only way is to outlast it.
Mhm.
And that is such a Taoist notion now that I like brought that all full circle in my mind. And it's amazing. And it talks about nature and the nature of things, which I understood Taoism more when I read Stoic texts. Those two things mix very well together. They complement one another.
Which hot take, Taoism is superior to Stoicism. Just gonna put that out there.
Whoa, shots fired, Ryan Holiday. What do you have to say about that?
But it's a more complete system. Stoicism is more practical because it's a pretty like straightforward guide for behavioral control.
Mm-hmm.
But if you study Taoism, like the point is, if you study Taoism, you will naturally come to the Stoic conclusions.
Yes.
Um, where Stoicism, true Stoicism, is coming to those conclusions by studying the Tao in its form. But how Stoicism is taught is, here's what Stoicism is, now do it, which isn't you lose the contemplative nature. They're like, you should contemplate, but I did it for you, so here's what you do, which is
Right.
just
It's an external thing, whereas Taoism is very much an internal thing. You can't understand it unless you start to live
except
and
for the
feel it.
external alchemy, which is freaking wild.
You know, so the alchemy part, a lot of it was to try and live forever, for various reasons.
It is exactly as alchemy always is it's to use the essence of things because it's more powerful. So it's just about elixirs in general. Of course, the golden elixir is eternal life, either physically or spiritually.
Yeah,
But the whole point was that all of life has the Tao in it, and if you can pull things to their truer form and make an elixir out of it, you could get a more potent Tao energy in you.
chi, some could say.
Right. And again,
Yeah,
that's why I made sure to like say that that practice comes from the fact that Qi was intertwined with Taoism before the Tao Te Ching.
absolutely. Yeah, and so other practices to cultivate that are tightly tightly wound up with Taoism these days. Uh, tai Chi, Tai Chi Chuan, where it is a series of very soft. It's a soft martial art, an inner internal martial art, where it is, and I took classes of this in college from a jazz bassist, very, very Taoist type dude, as you might imagine. He's exactly like you think he is. Imagine a Taoist jazz bassist. Yes, it was that guy. So it's a series of, yeah, you cultivate your inner energy and you move your body in such a way. The way it's taught is very imaginative when it's spoken of. Actually, the traditional form of learning it is to show up where people are doing it and start copying them, which
Mm.
is such a Taoist thing because in attempting, you organically grow into the movements and you go, oh, and it just kind of starts clicking. You start flowing into the positions because it's not rigid. It's not stiff muscles at all. You're just transferring your weight between stances and moving your internal energy here and there. It's very interesting, whether it's all in your mind or if there is some sort of energy field stuff going on. I'm not one to say by any means, but it does put you in a different state, which most people can attest to. And the
Mhm.
flow state, which a lot of people know from various like new age psychology type stuff, is very much tied in with Taoism and this kind of thing. That's what Wu Wei actually is. Translated, it means non-action, and this confused me for the longest, for years it confused me because it's like, well, does it mean literally do nothing
Mhm.
and like just life will happen and be fine? Kind of on a superficial level, maybe, but more so, it is really just, well, don't force things to be what they're not. Non-action doesn't mean don't do anything. It means don't do unnecessary things or don't force. Basically, if you can find a flow state, that's pretty close to the concept of Wu Wei.
I thought I wrote down the multi-layer transition for it, but apparently I didn't.
Sure.
But yeah, it's the it would be better translated as action without intent.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. And again, water being kind of the main example that they use. You know, water doesn't hurry. Water doesn't, if it hits a rock, it goes around the rock. It doesn't try to blast through the rock. And if it's blocking it, it'll eventually get through the rock.
Hmm.
Like water finds a way, you know? So it's very much, and that is honestly, Avatar does such a good job of this. The Last Airbender, the the Water Tribe siblings, Sokka and Katara, are probably the most focused on. Sokka, in particular, actually embodies this. He is not a bender. He doesn't cultivate his chi to move water, but he embodies Wu Wei. He learns how to eventually. He is a problem solver. He's the
Hmm.
inventive one. He finds ways around or ingenious ways of getting through things. Uh, and Toph is actually like this as well as an earthbender, but she's a different kind of earthbender because she's blind and her style, even her movement style, is the mantis style, which is
Hmm.
completely different from all the other earthbending styles. But her thing is neutral jing, they call it in the show, which is to wait and react.
Hmm.
Whereas normal earthbending is just plow through the damn
Hmm.
thing.
Yeah, force it.
You oppose, you force. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Wu Wei is personified in Sokka's inventiveness, ingeniousness, and in Toph's patience, her patient defense, where
Hmm.
she waits until the last moment and does just the right movement.
Which to Since we're already here with the Avatar things, it's why she trains Aang with hitting him with rocks. She doesn't teach him to throw rocks first. She teaches him to take a rock first.
Yep, absolutely. Yes. And Aang obviously does a lot of this with airbending as well. The airbending philosophy is mostly Buddhist. I mean, they straight up are Buddhist monks with the orange robes and everything.
Mhm. But the point is,
But
he grasped onto his ideals too much. He was holding too tight to an idea.
Precisely. Yes. And I mentioned this to Michael before recording. The airbending style is based off of Bagua, which is a martial arts style of China that is Taoist. It straight up is, because Bagua is the trigrams of the I Ching, which is a Taoist text. It's
Well, the I
older than
Ching,
Taoism, but
yeah.
yeah, it
Okay,
is. It's older than
so
Taoism, but it is.
part of us educating on Taoism, it came about during the 100 schools of thought. So there was a bunch of uh, different philosophies of religion and politics and all this stuff that all kind of popped up at the same time as China was going through this huge shift. Um, and then
The warring state, that shift being the warring states period. So
yes,
yeah,
and then two like China specific ones rose to the top, and they just pulled in the rest of the like second popular ones. So Confucianism and Taoism like came to the top, and most of the other ones like legalism came under Confucianism. Naturalism or yin yang came under Taoism, so they just kind of absorbed the second most popular ones, leaving just the two, and everything else kind of faded into the background.
yeah, which that is not a new concept. That has happened with most religions and philosophies.
But Taoism specifically, this is one of the things about it, is because it's so encompassing and fluid as a thought, as a concept, it can move into things and around things and like bring them in all kinds of really unique ways. I saw somebody talking about, you know, there's a bunch of modern critiques and people being like, oh, philosophy Taoism versus religion. It's like that's not a good way to describe it because they never saw it that way. However, Taoism had always been kind of like the piece of paper you wrote on. So it's like so modern New Age stuff, right? The stuff we consider Taoist philosophy is 100% in line with traditional Taoism because it had always just been the paper you write on. But when you say like, oh, there was philosophy and religion, that's not necessarily accurate. But when you're saying like, oh, this is Taoist philosophy, it's like okay, maybe it's not exactly how they understood it, but that's not how Taoism works. Taoism is an act of discovering. So the modern discovering is just as Taoist as the very original forms of Taoism, so long as it keeps to the Tao.
Absolutely, yeah. I have a note about this. I have a couple notes about this, so I'm going to continue on with that thought. The Taoist canon, all the texts, there's roughly like 1,500 official canon Taoist texts. Some philosophical, some regarding alchemy, demonology, things like that, because spirits entering and messing with things. Nature was not just plants and trees and rocks and humans and animals. It was the more spiritual aspects as well of demons and spirits, things like that. So again, like Michael said, from shamanic
Mm-hmm.
origins, poetry, um, instructing rulers. That's actually what the Tao Te Ching is more for. It's like it's akin to the prince, not in philosophy whatsoever,
It's
but
exactly what I was thinking.
right. But it is a text on, like, you hand this book to a king, to an emperor, to a general. Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War for just such a thing.
It's written like he's talking like in a crowd of people, and there's some like bureaucrats standing off on the side of the crowd. So he's like saying all this stuff, and every once in a while he leans to the side. And a ruler who does not intervene is a good ruler, but like the water, and then he just goes back to
Pretty much, yes, yes. And there's a lot of seemingly contradictory stuff in that book, but if you sadly you do need some context on Taoism, but luckily the book does provide that. But you kind of have to read it and then read it again and then keep
but
reading it for the rest of your life because it's new every single time.
but again, it's because it's a way,
Yeah,
right? That's
yeah.
the thing. It's not a religion. It's not a um you could say it's a truth because it is, but it's not a truth in the fact that it's an answer. It's not an answer. It's the thing to discover.
Hmm. Absolutely. So yeah, and that's so a couple of things with that. One thing that I try to impart on people and try to remember myself is that we humans, human beings, because we have the most imaginative cognition, so we think we're hot shit. We are not separate or above nature. We are part of it. We
Hmm.
tend to forget that. because we separate ourselves from it quite often in cities and just houses, and we shelter ourselves from the elements which we consider nature, but overall nature, we're a part of it, and we forget that quite often.
Hmm.
um, so one term that we can look at is, I have two terms I want to talk about. One is li, li, which is the manifestation of cosmic and organic order. So the natural order of the universe, such as like the rings on tree trunks. If you cut a tree, the rings. Um, the
Fibonacci
Fib-
sequence.
I was about to say that. Yeah, the Fibonacci sequence. In some ways, the Pareto principle is a form of Li, which, if you're not familiar with that one, the Pareto principle is the imbalance of resources. How do you put it? It's the natural imbalance of cause and effect, I suppose.
I think resources, if you take resources in an abstract way, because
Yeah,
it's not all the money goes to a few people. It's all not all the money. The majority of money goes to a few people. The majority of intelligence goes to a few people. The majority of physical competence goes to a few people. The majority of governing authority goes to a few people. The
right.
insert
And that's
literally
and that's
anything, and
macro. Yeah, that's macro and micro. The majority of which
it's
hand you use is mostly one hand.
yeah.
Like, yeah,
Yeah, think of two pyramids stacked on top of each other, one with the base up, one with the base down. That's you can put that on almost anything.
right, right. Um, Including and stuff like the the geometry of snowflakes. That's a form of Li. Just the natural order and formation of the universe. Uh, Einstein's theories. Like that's
Mhm.
uh, again, Taoism. The more you dig into it, the more it seems to be true. Like the more it just
And
makes a lot more sense.
and this is one of the important things to realize with the possible influences of Taoism into the West through the Middle East, but also why China became so technologically advanced in certain ways, is Taoism was super into science.
Yeah,
So,
it embraces it. It
full
embraces it.
heartedly.
Yeah. Uh, and then you have Pu, Pu, which is the main example is the return to what's called the uncarved block.
Mm,
And
that quote again.
we've discussed that a little bit, and we go back and forth about what that means, and there are better definitions than what we're going to talk about. But essentially, the way I've come to understand it right now in my journey is to return to the sense of potential
Hmm.
rather than force yourself to be something, or force a path that maybe isn't the best.
There's a very key line in the Tao Te Ching about it that only because I have a lot of context, I think made sense to me because it's one of those paradoxical ones.
Mm-hmm.
Because he extols the virtues of the uncarved block, that you need to get back to the uncarved block. But then he makes a passing comment right at the end of one of the stanzas, where it's, but the block becomes useful when it is carved.
Yeah, and they give a lot of examples of that. The spokes, like a wheel is only useful because of the axis where there's nothing.
Hmm.
The A room is only useful when you cut doors into it and open the space. The room is only useful because there's space there.
But the thing about the carved block thing is it's the only one of those that is contrasted. The rest of those, he's talking about the negative space as a virtue, but he had extolled the uncarved block as the natural state, which is the good state. So, in contrast, how can the usefulness be good? And then he compares it to other useful things. So, if you take the two pieces together, right, this is the plane with the paradox, you need to be able to return at any point to the uncarved block so that you can then reform to what the useful state is for the need,
True, true.
which
Yes.
is back to the water metaphors, but it's a more concrete uh, example, a more substantial example. But you don't want to, yeah, you don't want to become just a singular tool that only functions one way. You want to be consistently the uncarved block that then adapts to be useful as you create the negative. This is the withdrawing. You create the
Hmm.
negative space on your carved block by carving out your block. to be useful in the situation, and then you return to that full uncarved block state, so that you
Uh-huh.
then have the negative space to give again.
Right. And a character who embodies this in their story pretty well, in a specific part of their story, is Zuko in Avatar. He is obsessed with fulfilling his destiny and regaining his honor that his father, took from him and all that kind of stuff. Uh, and so he goes on this journey that he thinks he has to go into, and he trains hard. He gets better as a firebender, throughout the series. So he's working towards this thing and really making himself into what he thinks his father wants him to be, when in reality his father's a giant douchebag who doesn't actually care. But different different part of this conversation. Uh, it's in the episode in the third season where so he has decided now to join Aang's team, which is starting to help him return to who he really is. And he's about to teach Aang firebending, and he can't firebend anymore because it was his anger that he firebended with. So his anger was what was directing his chi. Sorry, my computer is not charging for some reason, so I'm gonna fix that real quick.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So while you're doing that, I saw an article about, again, to the credit of Avatar: The Last Airbender, such a good story, that Zuko goes through the three schools of the Chinese um, culture system. He starts as a
He sure
Confucian,
does. Yes, he does.
because that's why he listens to his dad, because the father figure and the ruling figure are sacred in Confucianism. Now
Mm-hmm.
they're expected to be good, so there's a different thing there, but you're still expected to uphold the order. Then he lets go of his worldly desires, like gives up the chase of the avatar and stuff like that. I was hoping that'll make him worthy, that'll make him whatever, but then he loses everything, right? He loses his fire, but he loses all sense. It's only when he lets truly lets go, and not just lets go of the worldliness, but lets go of wanting to be something,
Yep.
when he just starts to be.
Yep.
And he ends in Taoism. So Avatar: The Last Airbender is a Taoist thing, and it kind of shits on Confucianism and Buddhism a little bit.
In its way, in their ways, yes, yeah. It definitely tells the virtues of those things, but it also shows, yeah, that
Yeah, because like
it's not everything.
Uncle Iroh went through the same thing,
Yeah,
right?
in his
Like
backstory, right?
he's respected as the Dragon of the West. He's respected and has all those things. He learned all his lessons that he then used in his Taoist state, in the Confucius and Buddhist states. So he wouldn't
Right,
have achieved the full Tao
right,
if it wasn't for going through the other phases.
precisely. So in the episode, to culminate Zuko's thing that you were just talking about, in the episode, the Firebending Masters, I believe it was called, he goes and he finds the source of firebending. I'm sorry, the original masters of firebending. The source is the sun, so it's
But
about
he also but he also connects to the sun, because that's part of the thing.
right. It's the Sun Warriors, the Sun Tribe. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, and they're given a piece of the original fire. Apparently, it's a sacred fire that they have, and he's taught that through Aang actually noticing this. Like it's like a little heartbeat, and then the chief of this tribe talks about fire is a living thing. It's life. It's not destruction. It's not just used for power. It's just life. It's just potential, and that's a huge part. And then they meet the dragons and are shown the the life of fire, because the fire that the dragons use is the most beautiful, ornate, multi-colored, multi-dimensional thing that they ever experience, and it shows them that yeah, it's just potential, and then you can just release who you are, release everything. So Zuko comes away not wanting anything. He knows that to set the world right, he has to interact with his father and his sister and that part of his life again. But he is completely changed. And people have broken down the final fight between Azula, who is like dad's prodigy, uh, who suffers for it internally a
Mhm.
lot. She like refuses to admit it most of the time, but dad's prodigy versus Iroh's prodigy. The two ideals,
Hmm.
fighting it out. And Azula uses, strictly fire bending in anger. She is absolutely trying to kill this person just out of pure pride. And he, with pure humility, which is a story that Iroh talks about. Shame is not the what is it? Shame is not the opposite of pride, but its source. True humility is the opposite of pride.
Hmm.
So it is pride and shame of Azula versus the now true humility of Zuko. And Zuko's movements are all of the bending styles. You see him use an earthbending move and an airbending move, and even his firebending move, which is more of a breakdancing style, uh, which is an Easter egg because Dante Bosco, the voice actor, was a breakdancer once upon a time. Yeah. So that I swear that show has more Easter eggs than Jesus Christ.
Okay, so
Like,
so one of our deep dives, I guess, will be Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm in
oh
for
yes,
that.
please. Oh my God. Yeah.
I think we
Anyway.
have to do at least one nerdy thing,
Oh
not
yeah.
just all intellectual stuff.
Absolutely. Well, it's going to become intellectual real fast, so don't worry. But
Well, yeah.
so to sum it all up, yes, yeah, it is. He had to return to his uncarved block to actually enact any sort of change, but not through forcing change, through being change.
Hmm.
And that's a very important distinction. It might not always feel apparent when you're forcing it rather than being it, but usually if you're being change, you get a sense of flow to it. Maybe not even the like flow state kind of flow, but it's so hard to talk about, which is,
Yeah, but
but yeah.
it's
So it's easy to find a lot of. Is this the part where we should talk about different characters of different shows that personify this kind of thing?
yes, we can. So we can talk about characters that exemplify it. We'll start with the historical character outside of Lao Tzu,
Hmm.
which is the Yellow Emperor,
Yeah.
who is one of those, could be real, could be not, definitely turned into a mythical figure, regardless of if he was an actual person or not. Um, because he's not mentioned in the Tao Te Ching, but very quickly, um, and even the records about Lao Tzu say that he credited the Emperor for it, for all the stuff. For because this is the thing about the Yellow Emperor, he was considered part divine, um, considered the perfect statesman, and a master of the esoteric arts. And that was really important for all this other stuff. Again, you think of Taoism as like, no action. So don't do anything. Just sit on the mountain, drink tea, eat food. Like that's it. Mm-mm. Like it's considered that there's a cultivation of the esoteric arts is part of learning the way. Um, he's the first character that's meant to exemplify it in all stories. So the Yellow Emperor is the first, and also the reason that you get um, that connection with like how Taoism interplays with the state, which is just really a very big Eastern and Chinese thing, is that all the philosophies, all the religions really play into the like how divinity and uh, metaphysics plays into how politics and government's supposed to work.
Yeah,
And
and
so that's where you
which
see it all
which makes
intertwined.
sense. Yeah, which makes sense because if you think about that time in history, how people lived, it was the government and merchants and largely peasantry. Like farmers didn't have to, they had crops to deal with. They had,
Hmm.
they had to make sure their family survived because there was famine, there was disease, all that kind of stuff that was really hard to deal with. Uh, so they didn't really have the time or the need or the want to think about more esoteric things. So it did fall onto the statesmen, the people running the country and deciding its laws, to think about these things and
But
let it flow into culture.
there's, there's you can see this in the West with like, the Christian kings and Christian peasants, but it doesn't connect the same way as like Taoism does, like running the line through the the royalty to the bureaucrats to the merchants to like it is a much more uniform thing where you're all the same to the Tao. Where, in some of the westernized things, it's like you're raised up by God, and then the peasants are like in their place. In Taoism, it's you're all on the same level. You just happen to be in the government, which then plays a little bit into the Confucius philosophy aspects of it.
They do
Um,
play. They play well enough together.
yeah, but the point is, it levels people. It doesn't justify like the lineage. Um, it does that too, but specifically, it's the peasant could go up to the king and say, "I feel you've lost the Tao," and it would like the king could be like, "How dare you question me?" It's like you say that, it would be un-Taoist of me to not accept the fact that the world, nature, has you, a peasant, saying this to me. It must be very obvious. So that would
Hmm.
be the way you have to do it. If you responded out of anger, you would prove the point.
Precisely, yeah. And just a slight side tangent, if anyone is confused about why Confucianism and Taoism might not play well together, they do, because Confucianism largely is about knowing your role that you play in society or your family, or whichever micro or macro level you want to go with that, but your role and fulfilling it to the best of your ability, which can be a Taoist action.
Hmm.
So Confucius is know your part. Taoism is acting your part in the most natural way, in the best flow.
Hmm.
So just wanted to kind of put that in there as like a, because there are a lot of parables about why the two fight, more or less.
Hmm.
But realistically speaking, they play well together if you know what level
Uh,
you're at.
in day-to-day culture, they play well together. In the cosmology or cosmology or whatever, they don't,
Right,
because the whole point of Confucianism is we want it like heaven, and Taoists are like heaven and earth are the same.
right. Should I tell the story about the painting?
Sure. I think I feel like we've done that one before. I feel like
Okay,
we almost certainly done the pain one before.
okay, that's fine. Should I just,
Do it on a do
now
it
that we
do it
mentioned it,
on.
you're either gonna have to edit out or
No, people can go back and look for the other ones or put it in a TikTok, and I'll do it as a short.
okay, yes. So just stay tuned. To be continued. Yeah,
If you've mentioned that story to me so many times, I feel like we had to have mentioned it in one of the other ones. But
it
it's
is.
possible
Yes,
we mentioned it before or after or on another call. I don't know. So check out the shorts or TikTok if you want to hear the story and we for some reason didn't mention it in another one.
indeed. Or just request it. I read all these things. Just request it.
Well, let me tell you.
But
Okay, so you're gonna go through famous Taoist characters and stories.
yes, yes, in more or less modern stories. So, because I want people to, Taoism can sometimes, at least when you're first learning about it, be kind of hard to wrap your head around.
What the thing that you can't talk about is hard to wrap around?
Exactly. So sometimes, I mean, that's why stories exist, more or less, is
It-
to,
It's why there's 3 books for the Tao Te Ching, and one of them is a compilation of stories. It's
yeah,
one book, but it's like 80 stories.
yeah. I think, don't they call them the inner chapters or something like that? Or
I don't remember. Yeah, that's the Zhu
Zhuangshu.
Zhuangzi. Yeah,
I butchered that. We both did. That's fine.
that's my fault. I wrote
Yes.
down how to pronounce that one and I still messed it up. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's one book and it's 80 stories, and that's
Right.
considered a canon book.
And there's another book that I have, um, and it's by Hong Yingming, and it is called Master of the Three Ways: Reflections of a Chinese Sage on Living a Satisfying Life. So this sage, this intellectual, actually took the three schools and wrote a book. And you can't really tell which, it's written like the Tao Te Ching, so in verses, and you can't really tell which verse means which school.
I'll
Just
have to read that one.
yeah, it's very nice. It just forces you to kind of slot them all together, and it works. It's such a very nice puzzle that fits together well. So characters in pop culture that you can recognize Taoism in. The most famous one, and my favorite, is General Uncle Iroh.
Hmm.
He is kind of the epitome of the Taoist sage, to the point, I will argue, that he gains immortality.
Hmm.
because you see him in the Legend of Korra. You meet him in the spirit world, where other than perhaps the past avatars who have their own uh, Buddha style reincarnation going on, uh, he's the only human being that seems to live in the spirit realm.
Hmm.
So it's very interesting, and he does so by being in tune with it, by aligning himself with it. And the spiritual place is, you learn, especially in Korra, it is very Taoist. How Korra feels affects the area around her in the spirit realm. So, uh, and Iroh is like, he's very go with the flow. He even does the whole "you've got to feel the flow" thing in one episode. Yeah. So I could take a whole hour talking about Iroh, but we'll leave it there. So General Iroh,
We'll do an
very
episode on
right.
Avatar.
Yeah, yeah, very, very, very good modern example of Taoism in action. In inaction. Taoist joke. All right. Uh, Winnie the Pooh is another one. If you're not, if you don't remember or you're not sure, go read the books. There's a couple of books. They're really old, but read them. Winnie the Pooh is very Taoist. He's very simple in a good way. He takes every day as it is. He takes every situation as it is. Some of his solutions to things, like there's one story that I was just reading. Him and Rabbit, who is knowledgeable, Rabbit gathers knowledge to get things done.
Hmm.
Rabbit's very Confucius. And there's Piglet, which is also Taoist in a different way concerning nature, the nature of Piglet. Piglet is very Piglet.
Hmm.
um, so they're lost in the woods, and they keep coming by this. I think it's like a sand pit, just a hole, and they keep coming by it. And Rabbit is just like, I know where we are, and Pooh is just like, okay, but we're not where we're going. um, and the situation kind of revolves around like, well, we keep finding ourselves in that, we keep trying to find home, and we keep ending up in the same spot. And Pooh, in a very Taoist fashion that seems paradoxical, is just like, well, what if we leave this spot trying to find it?
Yeah, that's.
and they find their way home.
I haven't heard that story, but yeah, that's a
Yeah,
perfect
that
example
one,
of.
yeah, and that one, it's a perfect example, especially because it's in, it's an excerpt from a real story of Winnie the Pooh, but it's in the Tao of Pooh, so it's a wonderful read. Yeah. um some other famous ones, especially the more Eastern style, Master Oogway from Kung Fu Panda.
And
He,
arguably Poe.
absolutely, yes, Poe eventually, at least.
Yes, that's because the the scroll. The scroll is Taoism.
That's right, yes, yeah. Should we explain that if people haven't seen that movie?
I mean, no.
Go watch the movie. It's really nice. It's a
Yeah,
wonderful movie.
if you haven't even seen the memes of it, noodle, don't noodle.
It's fantastic. Um, Another Avatar character, Zahir, in a different way, is Taoist. After
Okay, yeah.
after the events of his arc, essentially.
And you see that a lot with a lot of these characters, is they have
Yeah,
to like go through an arc to reach it.
which journey of 1,000 miles. That's in the Tao Te Ching. That phrase, the journey of 1,000 miles, begins with a single step. That's Taoist.
Yeah, I didn't. That kind of blew my mind.
um, the Jedi, more or less, Yoda in particular, and the Jedi. People will argue like, well, no, they're not. They get, they become too exactly. They lose the Jedi way.
They
Taoism.
become too Confucius.
They do. They do. They do. Or they become, they embrace Jediism, but their pride flowers too much. And it's like, well, I'm the most Jedi of all. I embrace all the tenets and blah blah blah. It's like, well,
Hmm.
then you've lost the point. If you're talking to me about this, you've lost the point. Yeah, and that even happens to well, Yoda. Yoda is very Taoist because he kind of even sees it happening and just more or less lets it happen.
Because there's no way to stop it without making it worse.
Right. Yes. And which is why he goes to Dagobah, which is nature, like straight up. It's a swamp planet. There's
Dude,
no more nature. And honestly, another Avatar thing. I hate to keep harping back on it. I love to, but I don't mean to keep harping back on it. But there's a swamp episode of Avatar, and there's an enlightened being in the swamp. Like it's just a good example. I mean, so, but it's a swamp. We think of swamps as these like disgusting places, but they're just so full of life. Swamps,
hmm
like everything has just chock full of life in there. So there's obviously a lot of life energy in a swamp. So that's why Yoda goes there. So the force is very strong on Dagobah because it's so just abundant with life and energy.
That's also very uncomfortable
Yeah, yeah.
unless you
Too
just
much
accept the
energy is a real
reality.
thing. Yeah. Well, that's the cave, right? He makes Luke go into the cave, and it manifests as all his like fears and problems, and he
Hmm.
has to kind of let go and understand that and accept it. That's a big one. Uh, oh, let's see. Where do I even? Let's do this one. I don't know if it's on purpose or if it's just kind of a good example, but someone on the internet said Forrest Gump.
Oh, I remember you mentioning that before.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and I could see it because he is a rather simple dude, and he kind of flows through life. He doesn't make anything happen for himself necessarily. Things kind of happen, and he takes it and runs with it, and it morphs into new things and something else.
Hmm.
So,
He just
which, yeah,
he is him.
yeah,
That's
he is him. He does stuff. Stuff happens to him. He accepts it. He doesn't always understand it. That's not the point. He accepts
hmm
what's happening and just kind of runs with it. So yeah, I would. That's Taoism. Green stamp. um, who else? Oh, one of the most famous ones in Western pop culture is The Dude. The Big Lebowski
mm.
is a Taoist film. Yeah, and that's like not even debate. Like that's on purpose. That's not debated. That's not a perspective. It's like no, that's a Taoist movie. So for those who aren't familiar or have only seen it once, like watch it, wait a day, watch it again because you kind of have to experience it the first time. There's a lot. It's a lot in there.
hmm
It's quite a wild ride of a movie, and they kind of allude to that. Jeff Bridges in Tron 2 because he was the star of the original Tron as well. And so in Tron 2, he's trapped in the video game world and he's like, grown a beard and looks more like the dude, essentially. And at one point, the other main character is like doing something and he's sitting there, like sitting. And there's like a loud noise, he just screams back, "You're messing with my Zen thing, man." And kind of an allusion and
Yeah.
a nod to him being the dude. Love it. Uh,
Did Gandalf make the list?
no, because Gandalf specifically makes things happen.
But does he make them happen in the way? A wizard is never late, nor is he early.
He arrives precisely when he means to. Well,
And he chooses and he like understands that like he has to die, right? It's not like, oh, I need to do this, right? He's like, well, in order for the thing to happen, the way to move forward, I must die, and he just accepts it.
let's unpack that because
And he has this whole little thing speech, which is right out of the Tao Te Ching.
yeah, that's more in the movies, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah, whatever.
Hmm.
The principle of the character stands. I guess maybe there's a difference in the book, but not really, because the thing about magic in Lord of the Rings is it is very Taoist.
It's nature, yeah, or at least it's a natural force.
but it's an essence, right? It's an essence that pervades the world. So you tap
Right.
into the essence.
True. Yes. Well, actually, that is, yeah, and that actually opens up another couple of characters that I
And
can
he
talk
and
about.
he doesn't do things. He helps other people do things.
I suppose he rarely takes action, like direct
In fact,
action himself.
in fact, people get upset with him all the time for not doing things.
True. I'm trying to think. So let's see. Let's try and walk through the journey here. Yeah, he leads the dwarves. He doesn't make them do anything. He guides the dwarves. He
They were already going to do it, and he's just like, I'll just make sure it goes along.
make sure it actually, yeah. Uh, let's see. The Balrog, yeah, he kind of just sacrifices himself more or less. Or he even just he doesn't know he has to die while he's fighting the Balrog, but he knows that at that moment, like when he's hanging there and the whip is there, he's like,
Hmm.
well, okay, this is gonna happen, and he just
Hmm.
okay, I'm getting swayed. Yeah. Shadowfax, his horse is not his horse. He just calls it. It's a friend, you know.
Hmm.
Um,
He's friends with all the things of nature
yeah,
because he keeps the balance.
that is kind of his thing. Yeah. That is what the what were the wizards called? They're
Maiar.
yeah, that is what the Maiar were sent to do.
Finally, I've learned enough to like drop that kind of stuff.
Nice. Um, yeah, and a lot of them lose their way. Oh
All
my
of them.
god. Oh my god. So wow. Uh, so the two blues we can kind of discount because there's really not much about them. They go off and start their own schools.
But the
So
thought is that they lose their way. They start to become demigods. They're like, we're so great.
right, Radagast becomes Buddhist. He disengages with the world and goes into nature.
But he loses the way.
Yeah, and Saruman becomes Confucius by just rigid
Hmm.
rigid power structure and control. And the only way to defeat evil is to be like that. So it's heaven, mirrored in earth, but
Yep.
in more of an oppositional force. But still, it must mirror that in order to defeat it.
Yep.
Holy crap!
All that came from the fact that like he opens up with a wizard is never late nor is he early. That is 100% Taoist.
Right. He arrives precisely when he means to. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. No,
Want to
that's
blow stuff up?
right. Yeah. Want to get high and blow stuff up? Like that's
Hmm.
because the Shire weed or whatever they call it, it's weed. Yeah. It's
Well,
yeah.
and the Tao Te Ching talks a lot about the childishness of somebody who's connected to the way,
Hmm.
and that's oh, everybody has a problem with Gandalf because he never takes anything seriously, even though he's very serious about it.
Right. No, that's yeah. Okay. I will I will bow to that. That is an excellent addition to this list. That's awesome. In other terms of magic, that's really what opened up some stuff for me was Ursula K. Le Guin was a Taoist. Like she has her own translation of the Tao Te Ching.
Yep, I remember seeing that in some of the articles.
Yeah,
So Sparrowhawk is a Taoist,
right. So in the
hardcore.
I can't speak to her science fiction novels. I haven't read those personally, but
Mhm.
the Earthsea series, uh,
Especially the third
yeah,
one, which is the one I'm on. He is like painfully Taoist.
yes. Sometimes, and that is a very Taoist notion, right? Sometimes Taoist stories aren't all that entertaining. Like if
Well,
they're
it's certainly more entertaining than the second book. That's because there's more Sparrowhawk in it.
yeah. Yes, absolutely. But honestly, yeah, sometimes if the main character is Taoist in a story, you might not get a very like
Well, because
energy filled
the kid
story.
that the kid that takes with him is like, okay, so what are we doing now? He's like, well, we're looking. He's like, looking for what? What we're looking for. The kid's like, and
Yeah.
what is that? Well, we don't know, so we got to find out.
Yep.
So what are we doing? Well, we're looking to find out what we're looking for, so we can go find it. That
Uh-huh.
happens several times.
that's
It's like
wonderful.
some big thing will happen. He's like, okay, we must be farther along. He's like, well, do we know what we're looking for? Well, no. Do we know how to get there? No. So we're looking still.
Yep. Man, and now I'm harping back on Gandalf again in the Hobbit movie, the first one. Uh it's raining. And one of the dwarves is like, Master Wizard, can't you do something about this deluge? And he leans back, he's like, it's raining, Master Dwarf, and it will continue to rain until it's done. Yeah.
Yep.
Just
Which is one of the big lessons in the magic of Earthsea, where it's just like, you know, it's like yes, you can make the rain move, but you're doing something, so you're intervening.
yeah, which that's frowned upon. It's not as good to do
Hmm.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why the like evil magic users are considered evil. They're using that power to intervene quite
Not
heavy
even
handedly sometimes.
not even the evil ones, but the non-masters. All of the masters rarely do anything.
Sure.
But the ones that are like famous and like big in all the villages are the ones that do stuff. But that's also why there's problems everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Um there's
Yeah,
probably a good one.
some of the quotes from Wizard of Earthsea, I don't know how I haven't seen on the internet. They're so not Wizard of Earthsea, the whole Earthsea series.
Sure.
Some of the quotes are so good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very quotable series. The thing is, like, most people either skipped it or read it when they were, a lot of people read it when they were younger because the prose is rather simple. So kids can read it, they just won't understand necessarily.
And the so story, I don't know, 8 out of 10. Dialogue, 10 out of 10. Describing scenery, 2 out of 10.
Oh, yeah. What did you say? Like what did she say? Like the wind was windy
Okay,
or something? Yeah.
I was reading like yesterday, and it's like and the mast was pointing into a point. That was a
The
just use a
frustrating
thesaurus.
right. The frustrating redundancy is also a Taoist thing. I think you have to be in a frame of mind to read that kind of stuff sometimes.
Well, it puts you there, but it's not important. So you do glaze over it, and you just get to the next important thing.
Right. Which I guess if you were physically there, you'd notice it and then mentally move on, like,
Mhm.
so rather natural, I guess.
Yeah,
Boring
because
to
one of the
read because you want to like be hit. We're
because
also
one
just
of,
used to people like Tolkien and George R. R. Martin and people who are super descriptive with their stuff.
well, and she gets descriptive in odd places where it's like, and they walk into the market, and then she will list 13 different things being sold, way more than you need to.
Well, as Uncle Iroh once said when he went to a market, I didn't find what we were looking for, but I got the
You
next
know what's
best thing.
better.
Right, but it's better. Finding what I
I
wasn't
thought
looking
it
for
was
at a
looking
great
for the
price.
great
Yeah.
bargain.
Yeah. Which, oh man, that is such a. I went to Barnes and Noble today. I had some time to kill before a meeting, and I went to Barnes and Noble because I wanted to get. I have the Tao of Pooh. I bought the Tay of Piglet, which is his second book,
Hmm.
and I was in there for that book alone. 6 other ones. Do I have a problem? I don't know. But the student is ready, and there are just so many masters. There are
No,
so many teachers.
we've talked about this before. The idea is you're not buying books to read them. You're buying books to build your own library.
Hmm. Precisely. Yes, because I want to master. And I have, this is a bit of a tangent, but I have started to come to know myself and what I want enough to know what types of books I should be collecting right now. So it's not just like any little thing that might interest me. It's like, oh yeah, I am down this path at the moment. So it's a very like in the flow of my life situation where I
Mm.
used to buy books of like, oh yes, I would like to master quantum physics someday. So, yeah. Okay, so part of this is well actually let's keep going. I have a few more characters because I think it's a really good way to provide examples.
Right, right.
Um for those who've read it's a ongoing fantasy series, unfinished fantasy series called The King Killer Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. Fantastic prose, wonderful stories. Um, there's one character who I would definitely consider Taoist, and he is. So it's a medieval esque setting. It does definitely feel like you were plopped in a D&D campaign type of thing. And there is a school, the university, and it's where people who learn magic go, things of that nature. And there are masters of different subjects. So the guys in the black robes who sit at the table and judge everyone, do all that, and they teach the classes. One of them is the master namer, and naming is like an ancient art, like the stories of old. You know, the heroes of old could name things. It's a very usual concept of fantasy. The knowing the true name of things gives you
Hmm.
power over it. Uh, so the master namer is Elodin, and he is super Taoist. He's super kooky, super weird, like never wears shoes. You know, he's very childlike, like very childlike. He the main character, who is very smart, very intellectual, works really hard, like wants to achieve above all else, wants to learn the naming thing, and he kind of does do like the cup spilling over story to him. Like, you won't know names because you're trying to know names. Names kind of like happen to you, especially the name of the wind, which is the name of his first book, The Name of the Wind. Because the wind is the wind. You can't get that.
Hmm.
uh, so he like shit tests him. This is slightly a tangent, but he shit tests him. Be like, fine, you want to learn from me? Jump off the. They're on the roof of a building. Jump off the roof. And he's like, oh, this must be one of those stories where I'm about to do it and he'll stop me. And he says the chapter ends with, and the last thing I saw before I hit the ground was the shocked, horrified look on the master's face. And he survives, and other things happen, and it's a wonderful story. Highly recommend. But yeah, Elodin is like very Taoist, and I don't know if that's on purpose, but probably, even if it's
But
subconsciously.
I think we could distill this down real quick. That
Mm-hmm.
like it's from Taoism that we get the Zen, right? So if you want to use the word that most Westerns understand, Zen is Taoism. It's a proper Zen is slightly different, but it's Taoism.
Zen
So
is,
the
I would argue that Zen is a simplified version, because
yes.
Japan kind of did that. They didn't. I don't want to say Japan appropriated things, but they kind of did. They took it and made it a little more, like, they said it a little easier.
Hmm. But yeah, so for the Western mind, like when you think of any character who has like a Zen vibe about them and is slightly quirky,
Yeah,
like any character like that is quintessentially Taoist, and it has like all characters throughout all time. You can almost link all of them back to some influence of Taoism.
absolutely. Yeah, Isaac Netero from Hunter x Hunter, seems like this quirky old dude. You kind of, in the later series, in the later part of the series, he seems almost amoral, which is a Taoist thing. Taoists aren't. We talk about in the episode Good, I think,
Mhm.
the episode entitled Good of our podcast, of if you zoom out far enough, everything is good.
Well, and in the Tao Te Ching, it talks about enforcing morality creates more crime.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
absolutely.
so don't
Um,
focus on morality. Focus on being kind.
right. Not nice, but
Hmm.
kind. Yeah. Um,
Master Roshi probably would make the list. Again,
I would say
goofy.
at least Dragon Ball Master Roshi, maybe not Dragon Ball Z. He kind of gets
Yeah,
pushed to the side after a while.
but even when you're introduced to him, right? He's a quirky
Yeah,
old sage, like
yeah.
quirky
Um,
sages. Like
Spike
that's the.
there's a lot of anime versions. Spike from Cowboy Bebop is Taoist. You know, he's a bounty hunter, sure, but he doesn't like he's not super gung ho. He in most episodes he kind of just runs into his bounty.
Hmm.
He kind of just exists, and they all just come to him. Uh, the one I kind of am saving for last. Uh, I got a couple more that I want to mention because they're really relevant, I think. But
Okay.
Adventure Time, I'm just going to gloss over, but just to give people an idea,
Hmm.
things from Adventure Time, very Taoist. Uh, Jake, I would say Jake is a pretty good Taoist. Not
Hmm.
all the time, but again, you know, in general, his way of being is quite Taoist.
Hmm.
Steven Universe, Steven is a Taoist for the most part. Greg, his dad, is definitely one. He just kind of vibes. uh, in the Wheel of Time series, that is definitely uh, influenced a lot by Taoism. Robert Jordan, finished by Brandon Sanderson. One of the big fantasy series, the pillars of the genre. Uh, it has a lot to do with duality. So even older than Taoism, the naturalists.
Hmm.
The yin yang is a huge part. He even kind of uses he never doesn't call it that because he has his own world, but there's a yin yang that symbolizes a lot of things. And the magic is part of the weave. He talks about the weave of the universe being, time and space and all that is like a not a carpet. What's the hanging one on the wall? Tapestry.
Tapestry.
Yeah, that's the one. Uh, and how you pull on one end and the rest of it is influenced, things like that. Um, how people use magic is very interesting. Women, it's the same magic, but women use it by yin, I believe. I might be getting those mixed up, by female energy. So women use it by accepting, by embracing the source. They call it the source.
Hmm.
Men use it by grasping the source. So there's the female energy of accepting and the male energy of enacting.
Which to like emphasize, it is worded that way in the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah,
Now, Taoism sees men and women as equal beings because they're both just human manifestations of the Tao, but it refers to the thing that comes after the unity and duality. So the Trinity is the three thing is the mother of all. And it even says, can you be like a woman? Referring to the can you be accepting and nurturing at the same time? Can you have a child that is your child, but it is their own person? Right. So he talks about like the importance of the feminine, like cultivation and the personality specifically.
absolutely. Yeah. It's basically saying there's a time and a place for every type of energy. Because there are many times, the natural inclination is for us to try and control, try and reach out and enact to make things happen. So a lot of the discussion in the books and the tomes and the discussion on Taoism is to try and release that a little bit, to try and go the other way.
To qualify or clarify in words, it's not natural to grasp at things. That's the point. It's that when you're
Right,
disturbed, you start reaching and grabbing things.
right. And this is where it plays with Buddhism quite a bit, because the want,
The
the
des-
desire
yeah, the
is, yeah,
desire thing is where they link really heavily.
yeah, is causing a lot of suffering. And so now what it's saying is, yeah, so you need to try and return, be the uncarved block, right? Return to accepting things and rolling with that. Now, there is a time and a place, though, for exerting force. You can't just have one, right? That's
Hmm.
the whole imbalance of the force, right? The Jedi try to eradicate the Sith. That that won't work. There
Okay,
has to be
so
both.
so Poe, Kung Fu Panda is the perfect example of it because he's just there, and when like he gets hit, his body just whoop, 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 whap, and he punches. That's the concept of Taoism: is you let the force come in, and then it's or the lightning in Avatar. You let the force come in, and then you pull it out, but you don't try and force it because you're putting strain on yourself.
Right. The
You
lightning
let
redirection in Avatar, not the casting of it. But yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Yeah, but the point, and yeah, with Poe redirecting the punches and stuff, the point is you redirect the energy. So rather than forcing your own energy, and this goes to the longevity thing, which they're big on. So to live longer, don't force your energy out. Pull energy in and then redirect it out.
Yeah, or retain it.
What you see with boxing, when you see a master boxer, like it's almost always like a flow and then bah.
Absolutely. A good modern martial art, besides boxing, you're absolutely right. A good modern martial art that practices this type of thing is Brazilian Jiu Jitsu.
Hmm.
The master of it, the founder of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, he was a Brazilian man, very short in stature, went to Japan to learn Jiu Jitsu, Japanese Jiu Jitsu, the original kind. And it's a lot of leverage, but there was a lot of forcing of the leverage. So, and he's a man of small stature. I don't think he was very like strong, necessarily.
Hmm.
So he adapted it. It's called Brazilian Jiu Jitsu because he went back home and adapted it to his body and his way. And uh, an account of someone who sparred with him was what did they say? They said it was like wrestling an empty jacket.
Hmm. Which Baki, the anime,
uh-huh.
does a whole thing to that. Because like the super big guy comes into a jujitsu thing, and the guys are like, "Well, you're not trained. Like we know all the moves, we know how to get out of all the locks." He's like, "Well, what's the goal?" "Well, the goal is to get your opponent to the ground." It's like, "I can do that." They're like, "But you've never trained." Like, okay, go against a black belt. And the black belt like goes to get him in a lock, and the dude's just pure muscle, so he just grabs him and just pushes him down. So the guy's trying to do everything, but then the
Yeah.
master comes in, tiny little guy, and just grabs him by the hand and just flips him right to the ground. He's like, "Oh, that wasn't fair. That wasn't fair. Here, grab my gi." So he grabs his gi and then he just slips out of the gi and then flips him.
Yep.
Like,
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and that's a lot of, you know, uh, it's argued that Tai Chi is Kung Fu in slow motion. So, like, if you actually sped it up, it is real fighting moves, like you're doing a punch, but it's more meditative than practical.
mhm.
uh, all those things.
It
Yeah,
does
absolutely. It
not
is about the
translate to
redirection.
combat.
No, no, no,
There's there's plenty of examples of Tai Chi masters getting it handed to them.
yeah, yeah. To that note, part of Kung Fu's problem is that there's a lot of superficial movement, let's say, and either there's one of two things with that. There's either you haven't trained well enough to use it the right way, because there's probably a reason for it. You just haven't quite had it click yet, or this happened a lot where the masters, since we're so many different schools and so many students, trying to hijack things, and people would betray their masters, all that kind of stuff. The masters would hide the real style in a bunch of superficial movement, and
Well,
then once they were
because
ready,
because practical kung fu is just the basics.
yeah,
That's it.
yeah, um,
It's how to throw a punch with your body. It's how to deflect an incoming blow so you control their body and your stance and use your legs creatively.
yeah, man. Mr. Miyagi is another. Now that's karate, but you know, uh,
But the wax on wax off is crazy useful.
mhm. That's a real thing, by the way. Like
Hmm.
that movement is real. So, anyways, uh, yeah, it really is about the cultivation of energy and yourself and the acceptance of things, kind of letting go, either letting go or accepting, right? Like it's kind of two
Hmm.
directions, but the same concept, depending
Yeah.
on depending on the situation, depending on what you're doing. So, um, I right now, as of June 2023, am preparing for some music auditions, some classical music auditions, and it's the age old story of like there are some things that are out of your control, so don't try to control them. Control what you can control, type of thing.
Hmm.
And so, I'm practicing the pieces that I have to learn for this thing, and I'm usually in my head about what the committee, because you play for a committee of people, and it's easy to get in your head of, okay, well, what will they want? Like, are they going to like this kind of sound, or maybe they'll want it louder? Like, I know this ensemble usually plays things a little slower. Am I supposed to try and play it slower, even though the composer who wrote the piece wrote it at a certain speed? Like, you just start getting in that whole thing.
Hmm.
And my friend, who's a trumpet player, he's one of my best friends in the entire world. He pretty routinely, when I come crying to him when I'm up in my own head, he pretty routinely does one of the most Taoist things ever. He's not a Taoist really, but he tells me a very Taoist statement. He's like, "Dude, shut the fuck up and just play." And that usually like snaps me out of it. It's like, oh yeah, that's right. Like
Hmm.
play is a big part of Taoism. Play is used a lot when talking about the flow state in pop psychology, things like that.
Hmm.
Because you don't work music, you play music. You don't work a sport, you play a sport. You know, and
Hmm.
that concept can be stretched to many different areas of life. So it really is. I have to let go of my own inhibitions, my own ego, essentially, and I have to accept just whatever happens, essentially,
Hmm.
which is hard. Like, I'm not saying that's easy. It's simple. It's not easy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Simple, not easy.
Yeah. Because we have a whole, like, just web of, layers and cobwebs and all that stuff of just our wants and our desires and our regrets, which are essentially linked directly to desires. And just a whole bucket of shit that we have to get out of in order to accept life as it is in a good way. So because
Yeah, the
there's
trouble is,
Eeyore, right, who accepts life but always sees it in the negative, if we're going back to Winnie the Pooh.
yeah. Oh, and the trouble is, uh, it's easy to be a Taoist if you start out a Taoist. It's very hard to be a Taoist if you've already grabbed onto a lot of things
Mm-hmm.
because you
But
have a lot to
yeah,
lose.
true. Yeah, no, truly. And that is a very egocentric thing, um, in a very innocent way, right? You have a lot to lose.
Well, and it's because you have a lot to lose before you let go of it. The moment you let go of it, it's no longer lost.
Right.
But while you're holding it, you have to choose to lose it.
Yep.
So that's the price you pay for
Yeah.
grabbing on in the first place.
And one of the main tenets of Taoism, one of the main things that's absorbed and kind of made its own is the yin yang, the concept of yin yang, which is duality. So how they talk about it is we can't define something without having its opposite. So you can't let go of something without knowing what it is to hold on to it. So having an ego is not necessarily a bad thing. You're not wrong. It's just if you want change, if you want to continue, if you want things to flow better, you must understand what holding on is and understand what
Mm,
letting go is.
I would argue that's not the Taoist take on it.
No? Okay. What do you think?
The Taoist take is that you will know what loss is if you grab. So if you want to avoid loss, don't grab. If you want to experience, play.
Perhaps. I feel like we're talking about the same thing, though.
Sure, but you're saying to yeah. But if you're like, oh well, because you said know how to let go. It's like, well, you let go by not grabbing. That would be the Taoist thing.
I suppose.
Don't grab, and that's let go before you have to let go.
Sure.
It even says it in the Tao Te Ching, like
But you don't,
avoid.
I would say that you don't know what letting go is unless you know what holding on is. And we could
Mm,
both we could both be right, by the
yeah.
way. Or we could both be wrong because you don't know what is right without knowing what's wrong.
Hmm. Now we're into like our usual type of discussions.
Well, and that's a very this is part of the confusion around, not maybe not confusion. This is why Taoism is so deep,
Tricky.
right? Yeah, yeah. Honestly, yeah. No, it's not tricky. We make it tricky, right? The Tao is not tricking anyone. It's not trying to do any of that. It's not trying at all. The Tao just is. We're the ones that convolute it.
And we don't even convolute it. We just get confused.
Yeah, because it's incomprehensible. But
But
think of it
not.
like that's they make a point of saying a lot of things like that. There is, you don't know noise until you know silence. You don't know hard until you know soft. Like you know things in its opposites.
In the Tao Te Ching, it doesn't talk about that much.
You don't know?
Mm-mm. It doesn't talk about the knowing aspect that you keep talking about.
Okay.
In
Well,
fact,
I
what
mean,
it says
then what?
what what it says is, okay, so let's say you want a relationship, right? Like you want to grab on. We're talking about the lost thing. Um, you really want it? Okay, well, if you really want it, you should give in to the opposite, right? So if you're really feeling the energy or whatever, the male energy, right? If you're really feeling the
Mhm,
male energy, give in to the female energy instead. So whatever the thing seems to be, push into the opposite.
I
So if you
suppose.
really want that relationship, really like let go of it, like not let go right from the start, and that's how you're more likely to get it. So if you
Okay.
really want to be strong, focus on like being in a vulnerable state. That'll make you more strong. So it's always this
Yeah.
concept. If you want to be this,
You know what?
become the opposite.
Yeah. And
Become the
my
vessel.
yeah. No. And it's cool that you mentioned, if you want to be strong, be in a more vulnerable state. Because my friend who I was just talking about, who tells me just to shut the fuck up and play, he he has won a few auditions, and those are very difficult to win,
Hmm.
supremely difficult to win. Um, and he told me the other day that the only reason he's gained success in that manner is because he is a very vulnerable player, and that is the word he used. He's a very
Hmm.
vulnerable player. So he's a very strong musician because he's a very vulnerable player. He
Yeah.
lets
And
things
this is
go.
where English gets tricky because people think strong and weak are like opposites, right? So it's like even in some of the book translations, it says if you want to be strong, be weak, and it just doesn't translate well to the
Right.
English like
Yeah.
ear.
So what we're discussing right now is the second verse in the Tao Te Ching. It is, everybody understands the beautiful to be beautiful. Oh God, we're going to go back to those videos. But okay, everybody understands the beautiful to be beautiful. But this only creates the concept of ugly.
Hmm.
Everybody understands good to be good, but this only creates the concept of bad. There can be no existence without non existence, no difficult without easy, no long without short, no high without low. And without the sounds of musical instruments and human voices, where would their harmony and cacophony be? So you need, well, that one makes less sense. I'd have to unpack that one. But
That one's
yeah,
hard to.
yeah,
I've seen several translations; those are all hard.
yeah. But yeah, before and after only depend on which one follows first. Therefore, the sage, the wise one, resides in non fabrication in this translation and conducts himself according to wordless teachings. So you kind of
Hmm.
just have to experience things and live.
Which is where then this is like again. Think when you think of a character that's Taoist, think of obnoxious sage, right? It's like I don't I don't want to like loser. It's like there's no lose. Don't hold. Don't hold. No loss. Right? Like,
Right.
well, what do you mean? Like, I gotta keep her. No, don't keep. Don't keep. If you're not keeping, there's no losing. Right?
Precisely. Yeah. The
You can't lose what you don't have. And it's like that's terrible advice. It's like, is it though?
is it though? Yeah. Right. That's because it's not advice. It's more just kind of a fact.
Both?
Right.
Which is the
Um,
point, right? It's both.
right. The That just reminds me of one more character that I had on this list. We discussed it a little bit, but I'll bring it up here on the recording. The Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, that one's tricky. I haven't read the book, so I don't know how the character is like fully portrayed.
Very much a neutral character.
And I guess
So
playful, so childlike,
yeah,
says
and just
paradoxical
yeah,
things.
very paradoxical. It's like, well, which way is that way? What's that way? Or is it this way? Is this
Yeah.
way that way? That kind of stuff. Like yeah.
And yeah, that's like my personal philosophy came from discovering that paradoxical play like on my own just through deconstructing every philosophy that came in front of me.
Yeah.
um and that's what makes people really frustrated with Taoism and any of the stuff once you get down to its like deepest levels
Hmm.
is you have to be able to play with paradoxes. And it's because the whole point is that what is my favorite one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite movies um, is the what is essential cannot be seen. It's only with the heart that one can see rightly. But again, the point is like words are going to fail you when you get to these deeper concepts.
Hmm.
So what you have to do is you have to make the words break on each other and let your mind do the work. Let the words clash like atoms, right? To like build that energy and then catch the energy in your mind and use that to get to the next level of thought.
Hmm.
But most people just
Absolutely.
have to have the explosion happen and their head explodes too.
And that's what, yeah, and that's what the Zen koans are for. The most famous one, I think, in the West being, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" They're they're riddles with no answer, you know,
Hmm.
and you wrap your head around it, and you fatigue your brain so much by thinking about trying to answer it, and then it just kind of falls apart. And usually, uh, it's infamous. These koans, these riddles, are infamous for students to just beat their heads against them, and then at the very end they end up laughing.
Well, and then one of the Zen ones is one of my favorite quotes. And again, the, this whole thing made me really want to work on the book. From the quote where uh, before man studies Zen, it is shit. When a man studies Zen, it is gold. When man masters Zen, it is shit. But then I sent you the picture from one of the actual canon stories,
Hmm.
um, and it's a like a bureaucrat or like a king, right? Somebody high in society is with the Taoist master, and he's like, "But how do I find the way?" He's like, "They're like you're asking the wrong question." He's like, "Well, you're the master. Show it to me." He's like, "It's in the ant." He's like, "In something so low? No, it's in the grass. How something even lower still? No, it's in the dirt. How low could it possibly go? Well, it is the piss and the shit." And the play that like the master's using commentary is like whenever somebody tries to put Taoism on a pedestal, it's the master's job to be like, you're going at it the wrong way. You want to go
Hmm.
high, go low, right? Like that's the whole
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. If I'm to use another, not to just like layer all these parables together and all these sayings, but a really good example of what you're talking about is the finger pointing to the moon, right? You know that one?
Mm-mm,
So, a student asks the master, "Master, what is the Tao? What is enlightenment?" It doesn't really matter. Insert your philosophy here. What is perfection? And the master points to the moon, and the student stares at the master's hand. Yeah, that's basically, yeah. The fact that you're laughing means you probably get get the idea. Yes.
it's funny because both answers are wrong.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
D, none of the above.
Right. Right. Yeah. Oh goodness. But yeah, so to kind of bring it back, uh, the end of this like second verse might help us. It's before and after only depend on which follows the first one. Um, the sage resides in non fabrication and conducts himself according to wordless teachings. All objects in the world come into existence, but he does not judge them, which means he just accepts them for what they are and moves on, or doesn't. But they are born, but he does not possess them, doesn't grasp, like you said.
Hmm.
The sage acts, but relies on nothing. Wu wei, essentially.
Hmm.
He accomplishes and moves on. By moving on, he never has to leave. Flow, essentially.
Yeah, well, the translation I read today had a lot about um, takes no credit,
Hmm.
and it's the Futurama bit of when you do something right, people won't think you did anything at all. That is the way, like that is the action. That is the way of the action. The Tao of the action is to
Hmm.
do an action in such a way that people, the whole universe is just like, yes, of course that happened. Like it
Yeah,
wasn't you, it just was.
yeah, yeah. It's part of why I got into Taoism is because I'm a musician. And one of the big things of playing in an ensemble, so not a soloist necessarily, but playing in an ensemble, uh, this was said, one of the students of the one of the renowned bass trombone players of the Chicago Symphony. So they have a super famous brass section, especially back in like the 50s, 60s. Uh, just absolute top tier, fantastic artistry and sound and all that. So the bass trombonist was also a teacher, and one of his students after a concert, you know, this is a real story. It sounds like a parable. It's not a real. It's a real story. Uh, said, "Oh, Mr. Kleinhammer, you sounded great today," and he actually got upset because it's like, well, if you just heard me, then
You weren't listening to
you
what
weren't
I was trying to
listening. Yeah,
do.
yeah, then you weren't listening. Yeah,
Or I was playing wrong because you were supposed to hear the piece.
precisely. That's exactly right. Yeah. So that's why I'm Taoist, is because I want to flow with the energy of the whole piece of music. I want to, and I'm slightly Confucius as well. That's why it all meshes together so well, because I want to fit my role. I want to
It's
play
also
my
why you
role to the best of my
butt your
ability.
own head.
Uh huh.
And then my thing is I have such a the pet peeve of like learning some of these things, and then you see somebody like somebody's like, oh, my meditation is so peaceful. There is no school of thought, no teaching, no esoteric school, no anything where the phrase "my meditation was so peaceful" should ever come out of your mouth. If
Right.
that you say anything like that, you have missed the point of whatever the teaching was entirely.
Yeah. Like my
The
prayer was
shit.
so holy. My prayer was so divine.
Yeah,
Mm, those who speak do not know.
yeah.
Yeah.
Which is the tag I put on our TikTok today.
Wonderful. Fantastic.
Because it
The
just,
irony of it, because all we do is talk about stuff.
yeah, the irony was not lost on me. But we admittedly are fools. That is the whole point. We
Yes.
do not know. That
Yes.
that's what we're not trying to say we know.
Right. And that's partially why the sages in all of these stories and historical people are a little quirky, because they know that to talk about it is rather silly, but they also know that without kind of discussing it, people won't quite
But you,
get
but
attuned.
the only way it works is when it's um, the redirection, right? Somebody asks a question, they then get like you just in your natural response, give them the Tao. But you don't sit down on your camera and be like, "Here's how to Tao today."
Yes. So is the
And the only reason we're talking about it is because in every episode we've had where we were chatting, one of us mentions Taoism or the concepts of Taoism.
yeah.
This is just us trying to be like, okay, well, we're going to give context for all the rest of them. So it wasn't like we're out of our way to be like, look how great Tao is. It's just, here's the context to this thing we keep referring to.
Yes, and I'm so glad you've gotten more into it. It has been one of the main pillars of like who I am as a person since I was
Turn,
a
turns out,
teenager.
same with me. I just didn't have a name for it because it doesn't have a name.
Right. Right. Yes. So I would argue that you're more Taoist than I am, which that means nothing. But like, but if we're gonna try and put it in those kinds of terms, like, yeah, you get it, or you achieved it more than I. Well, that none of that matters at all. Like I'm
Yep.
going anti-Taoist by even talking about
And the
this.
words fail us.
Yep. Yep. So, which is a whole thing, and we're like doubly part of talking about Taoism is that we are doubly encumbered, because the first thing they say is that words will fail you.
Mhm.
And we're dealing with translation of ancient Chinese.
That's why for this episode, I got notes on like what are the three treasures? What are the virtues? How are the tie-ins with Buddhism and Confucianism? I was going more like historical and academic,
Which is
trying to
okay.
avoid,
Esoteric.
well, avoid it being a chat because it's supposed to be a deep dive.
Hmm.
And two, just having the irony of trying to discuss it is
Right.
not lost on me.
Right. Yes. I don't think we have diverged too much. I think it's a good overall.
I think we at least like I made sure to deep dive into some of the. I focused on the things that if you try and look up Taoism, you're not going to get necessarily right away.
Right.
You'll get the three schools. Um, you'll get some of the stories and stuff like that, but you won't get like tidbits as quickly without a deep dive about the fact that there was a book that came before, or that the Yellow Emperor is like the mythical character that like it came from. So I tried to make sure we got some little bits where if somebody brings up Taoism, you can probably add something that's like, ah, did you know? Um, to be very anti-Taoist and show somebody how much you know. Or I guess maybe to make it more playful because you have more to play with. That'll be the redeeming quality.
Absolutely, yeah. So let me ask you, with all that being said, is there anything in your notes of like more historical context that you feel would be important to share
I mean, one of the
that we
things I
haven't
thought was
touched on, I
interesting.
guess?
One of the things I thought was interesting because the paradox of the alchemy thing versus the like non-action thing I thought was really interesting. But feng shui comes out of Taoism,
Oh, that's right. We haven't touched on that. It's I have it written down like three times in here. But yeah,
and again, it comes from the book before that talks about qi. So it's a predated concept that like moves through the Tao Te Ching.
right.
It's connected with Taoism, but it doesn't come up in the Tao Te Ching, and the Tao Te Ching would make you think it's not relevant. But
Right.
there is an order, right? Which is why Confucianism and Taoism go together. It's not about no order; it's about the right order,
The
similar to
natural order.
Confucianism.
Yeah.
Natural order, yeah. But the natural order isn't the order of heaven. That's the difference between Confucianism and Taoism.
Right. Uh yeah. So yeah, and that's just it. Confucianism talks about heaven has the natural order and we have to try and match that. Whereas Taoism, heaven is a natural order and earth is a reflection of that. So both are natural, naturally ordered.
I don't know if you kept talking or
Yeah, you cut out just a little bit, but that's okay.
I know the recordings keep going, so I'm going to curious to see if when it stopped for me, if it stops in the recording or if you kept going. If it's just
Okay,
dead air, we'll cut it. Otherwise, I'll whatever. So
that's fine.
for
Yeah,
people just listening, things froze. I think your system might start struggling once we get to the 2 hour mark because this happened last time. We got really long into the episode
true. Okay, that is
because it
good
might
to
be
know.
trying to like hold on to the whole recording file you're doing.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, because my
So we
internet
might,
has been fine. I've been monitoring. It's okay. But
yeah, it might just be processing power.
okay, yeah. Uh, so I actually have a note about that. Taoists see heaven, earth, and our bodies as reflections of each other, all connected by qi.
Hmm.
Um, and then I actually have a question that I asked about that statement. So in that context, is nature versus nurture in the um, psychological aspects? Is nature versus nurture relevant in this? If we look at the state of the modern world, does that seem true? Psychologically, it makes sense, even without the mysticism, like the mysticism part of chi.
Well, it's the they've done a lot more studies about it. But it's like people learn more in 1 hour of play, right? Like that's the whole
Mm-hmm.
anecdote.
Sure, that and just being our environment affects us. If it's cloudy and gray out, people are generally a little sadder or shittier towards one another. Or when the sun
If
is
they
out, people are
if
definitely happier.
they associate cloudiness and raininess with those kinds of feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, is it universal? Is the other thing. Does it matter if it's universal?
The concept of feng shui is there's universals, which this is something that I thought reading about Taoism was going to destroy because I'm big on the metaphysics of aesthetics
Mm-hmm.
or and the psychology of it, right? Like a place for everything, everything in its place. That there
Mm-hmm.
is something to that psychologically or metaphysically. And I thought that like reading the Tao Te Ching, it seems like it's going to be like that's all fluff and nonsense, especially with your parable about the wall, because technically that isn't accurate to the Taoist thing. It's meant to get across like it's a funny thing to like compare the two, but it's actually not very Taoist because of the feng shui element.
Yeah. And yeah, they just talk about a door is only useful because it's a door. Like it's empty space, but that's the whole point.
But the point is the flow. So you want the chi to flow through you, to flow through your room, to flow through your neighborhood and your community, and the whole point is to get all the universal chi to flow.
Yes. So let's actually, because people have probably heard the term feng shui, but let's make sure we actually kind of put a pin in it for a second. Of feng shui is loosely the if you the physical organization of the physical world so that chi flows well through it and you can be a part of that flow. You cultivate chi flow in the physical realm. Would is that pretty accurate, do you think?
Yeah, yeah, because it this isn't the like this is from an article. This article might have pulled it right from somewhere, but by definition, feng shui is a practice of arranging pieces in living spaces to create balance with the natural world. This is what it means to feng shui your home. The goal is to harness the energy forces and establish harmony between an individual and their environment. But again, it comes to this thing that if you read the Tao Te Ching, it doesn't give you an idea about how important qi is to Taoism. So when people talk about the Tao Te Ching as like the pinnacle of Taoist philosophy, it's the pinnacle of the virtues of the Tao, which is what it's called. The virtue of Tao is what it translates to. But it's not um, the one that came before it, the Ninya, Nia.
I'm not sure.
I could not find the pronunciation for it. Neiye. Ninya, Nia, Nia, whatever.
Ni
But
the
that's the first
Naya, yeah.
book that Tao appears, and it's a book about chi. So if you read the Tao Te Ching, you just get really the philosophical thing, but chi is critical to the understanding of how Taoism works in the world and how you're supposed to live
Yeah.
with the Tao.
And actually I have a note just to kind of put context on that. Taoism as a kind of codified thing. It wasn't codified. All the ideas kind of percolated around for literally 2 centuries before Taoism became what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So like these ideas are ancient, even by ancient standards.
Yeah, yeah. The Tao existed hundreds of years before there was Taoist,
Right. Yeah.
because there
It's
was no
like
Taoist until there was a organized religion.
yeah,
You just
Chinese
like
philosophy
you understood the
is
Tao,
yeah,
but you weren't an official Taoist.
right. Yeah.
In fact, you were an official Taoist even if you practiced everything about the Taoist. You were only Taoist if you were part of the church or the temple.
Yeah.
But the point about the like you can't separate philosophical Taoism from religious Taoism is because the practices, right, the rituals, the alchemy, the shamanism, that's part of it. Because part of how you live with the natural world is from the Eastern aspect of like heaven has this order and dance and pageantry. So you do that here. So it's not when people think natural, they're like, oh, like Native Americans on tribes. It's like no, no, no. There's a in the context that Taoism was formed, there was a pageantry to how like the divine played down into the world, and you played that like back up in its own way.
Yeah. Yeah. It might have similar roots to like deep down, far down, similar roots to Shintoism in Japan. Because Shintoism is it's a localized, organic, um, religion, I guess. But it's like its origins are very unclear. But it kind of just grew out, and it's just part of the natural culture of Japan. But it does have to do with nature spirits and respecting those and giving them places to
Yes.
be.
So that's the
Yeah.
important thing that people don't understand about Taoism is that it came out of the
Hmm.
practices were shamanic. Taoism was the understanding. The Tao was the thing that was pervading through the spirits, through
Mhm.
the humans. It was the thing that leveled everything into one big whole. But what they did was they danced around and did these rituals and prayed and burned incense. Like there's a bunch of different things that went along with it. It wasn't the Buddhist thing which came later, which is like, well, you sit up on the side of a mountain. And even that premise is, different because Buddhism very quickly became very ritual heavy.
Taoists, yeah, they didn't even remove themselves in like monastic ways. They went and become hermits, which is different than being a monk.
And again, that doesn't again the trouble is like that's not what Taoists did. Taoists were the people didn't exist until the organized temples existed.
Sure.
So somebody who was like somebody who followed the Tao would be the way to say it. Somebody who followed the Tao could easily be enticed to go be a hermit.
Sure. Now,
But
I will say that times change, right? So I call
mhm.
myself a Taoist a lot of times. I don't do those rituals.
Well, but this is the point I made earlier, where it's like if you do any rituals that honor the Tao, you're a Taoist. It doesn't have to be that because this is where like it's like yeah, lots of Taoists in Buddhism, but like Taoism doesn't care about Buddhism.
No,
Like it's like practice whatever works to get you in touch with the Tao. It just so happens that the disconnected from desire, like there's a lot of good things that
well,
like relate to
it's
the
how
two.
Zen Buddhism came about, right? That version
Mhm.
of Taoism.
But yeah, so like a
Yeah,
Taoist Buddhist is like, they're practicing the Eightfold Path and all this stuff. It's like, yeah, so like, how are you feeling about Nirvana? It's like, well, you have a goal? You're missing the
right,
point.
right. Yep, yep. Oh, it's like that meme of just like, oh, I achieved nirvana. Oh, I'm entering heaven. Oh, I'm one with the universe. You guys are achieving? No,
Hey,
absolutely.
so, what suffering were you trying to escape? Uh, What suffering are you talking about? I do
Right,
this because it's fun.
right. And that, Zen Buddhism does a really good job of giving a life to Taoism in a way. Because Zen Buddhism is very much a mundane thing. It's not meant to
Well,
be this.
it's more Tao than it is Buddhism,
Precisely. Yeah, absolutely.
which is why people call it Zen and not Zen Buddhism.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Um, some resources. I want to make sure people have resources to dive into if they would like. So obviously, really any translation of the Tao Te Ching will do. Just
Anything,
understand.
read at least two different translations.
Right. And it's an ancient text, so
It's
probably don't.
free.
Yeah, so you probably
Yeah.
don't have to pay for some. I
Tao
buy
Te
them
Ching
because I like having
PDF.
physical books. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was in Barnes and Noble today, June of 2023. I saw five different translations of it. So easy to come by.
And it's funny because line by line they have their strengths. Some of them get one line really good, the next one terrible, and
Precisely. But that's why, yeah, that's why. And don't just read the Tao Te Ching, read other stuff, see how the Tao might interact with that,
uh, read the NEIYE, the Inner Enterprise, the Inner Enterprise interpretation. That's the like title, Inner Enterprise. That's considered the most accurate, but it's called the Inward Training, is how it's normally translated. But that's the predecessor of the Tao Te Ching and gives you a much better idea of the world that Taoism exists in.
Yes. And the other, so there's those two, and the other main, there's like three main texts. There's those two and the Zhuangzi.
Okay, but that's if you want to read some fiction that's Tao inspired, read that one.
Which stories are usually how you experience some of these
Or
things.
Aleister Crowley's uh, The Drug and Other Stories has several Tao stories in them. One of them where he it's him pretending to like be a character in his own story where he goes into the East, um, and he goes into the political sphere and he basically tries to teach them all Taoism about like non-action and things go amok, but then they work out.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's that seems about right. Um, I've mentioned it before, but just since we're talking about the list of stuff, Benjamin Hoff, The Tao of Pooh, and his second
That's
book, the Tay of Piglet.
yeah, those are the Tao of Pooh is considered like the book to read. It's like if you're gonna buy one, don't buy a physical copy of the Tao Te Ching. Buy the Tao of Pooh.
Yep. Uh, some more. There is The Watercourse Way, which is Alan Watts, who is a very famous philosopher
Hmm.
from the 50s and 60s. Uh, if you're not familiar with him, if you're on TikTok or things like that, you've probably heard his voice over music and some pretty scenery.
Yeah, if there was a spacey voice over some psychedelic scenery and somebody's talking, it's Alan Watts.
Probably, yes. Uh, and he is very much was he's passed away, but he was very much the sage type. He was kind of a quirky, laid back. He saw the hilarity of life, the absurdity, and played in it. He was
Hmm.
very much that kind of person. And he has many books about many things: Zen and Taoism, um, Christianity, and its more esoteric leanings. Lots of things. He's a great author to look into. The I Ching is
Oh, that one's a hard read though.
it is no, it is. I'm not going to sugarcoat that by any means. The I Ching is more ancient than Taoism. It is a book on divination, essentially.
That's the thing. It's a book on divination. It's not like the other first two, the uh, Nina or the Tao Te Ching, where it's like these poetic parables. It
Mhm.
is literally like, here's the thing, here's what it represents. It's like reading a book about the tarot. It's like here's what the card is, here's the images on it. Like so, it
It
can be really
precisely
tough
is, yeah.
to read through.
Precise. But if you're into tarot or rune readings, or and the I Ching was used by a lot of leaders in that society, to make decisions. Not so much. A lot of them did believe, because how. Sorry, I need to gather my thoughts. But what it was is they understood that they need to understand the flow of the universe type of thing, and try to just get it focused, essentially. So this divination method was really just to help them focus their thoughts and see, because the universe is all chance and the flow and an
Mm.
order that we aren't
And
really able
in
to
what in
control.
one of the two books, it talks about how like there is the nameless, but when it became manifest, there became names. So learn names. That's the point. Is like don't just like it's all nameless. Like nothing matters, man. Like you're me and I'm you. It's like okay, don't get stuck there. Like we have names, use the names, like learn the names, learn what they mean, learn what they represent, learn how they flow.
Precisely. Learn what
And
they're
the I
not.
Ching,
Yeah.
yeah, and the I Ching is the like Eastern compartmentalization of everything is supposed to fit within the I Ching.
Hmm. So essentially, it's very similar to tarot, very similar to those kinds of ideas. And
Hmm.
I've heard people call it, if you end up on Witch Talk, which I do sometimes, uh, I've heard, people say, like, do I think it's magic? Probably not. Do I think it's spicy psychology? Yeah. But
Hmm.
really, that's what a lot of that stuff is. It's meant not to take something out and get from outside and give it to you internally. Quite the opposite, actually. These things are help to help you manifest your thoughts and focus them to a point where you
Hmm.
can actually conceptualize what you're trying to get a hold of.
Yeah,
So
it's
that's
to
very
help.
much
It's
that.
to help make a mental map.
Precisely. So the I Ching, if you'd like to look into that, is a good. It's pretty cool. Um, that was really, and then again, Hong Ying Ming, The Master of the Three Ways, is a great book that reads like the Tao Te Ching, and it's a wonderful interplay between the three schools of thought of that time. Yeah. Otherwise, like, there's podcasts that talk about these things, YouTube videos. I used a lot of YouTube videos to study this stuff.
My trouble is like when you first look it up, it's all the same people talking about the same things.
Yes.
And a lot of it, this is partly why we got into the discussion pretty quickly. Not pretty quickly, but we got into quite a bit of discussion, is because it's the philosophy aspect is meant to be worked through. So if you're talking about it from that perspective, you're going to have to talk about it. And again, the point of talking about it isn't that the talking is defining it, it's the negative space, right? You're creating the space where it exists so then you can move into that space. Um, but then it's like the historical stuff is actually kind of lackluster. There's some cool stuff, and like I said, the biggest thing that you don't hear about that I found out is the thing like the chi and the alchemy thing, right? It's you hear it's like, oh, there was the three schools and it developed into this religion, but what you don't hear about the way it was practiced is that magic, what we would call magic, was integral to it. In fact, the Tao was what justified magic in the world. So that's one of the huge things that you don't get when you read like a surface level of any of it. Even if you read the Tao Te Ching, that doesn't come across.
Precisely. Yeah. And magic in most esoteric schools, you can confirm or correct me on this, is a change of state. That's really
Mm-hmm.
the whole point and practice of magic is a change from one thing to another.
By understanding the nature of things. It
Correct.
is, yeah, Western esoteric magic systems were based on the fundamental premise of Taoism.
Hmm.
So,
Absolutely. So, and that's part of, if you want to learn more about Taoism, read some of the materials we've mentioned for sure. Look up some content on it, but honestly, just go live your life, be observant, and see how the Tao manifests. See how you
well,
manifest the Tao.
play with the paradoxes, like
Yeah,
in your life.
yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. And look at other philosophies, other religions. Again, I understood Taoism a lot more when I read Stoic texts.
Oh, and dropped out of the call. So, hope you guys enjoy, guys and gals, and others, and everybody enjoyed that. If you have any questions, feel free to leave comments. We'll try and get them as soon as we can. I'll put our email in there so you can email questions, and then we'll do shorts and TikToks to answer the questions. Yeah.